Welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of ECig 101. So this one's probably going to be one of the shorter episodes because what we're going to be doing here, you're going to be hearing a lot of terms, like a lot of vapey speak, if you want to call it that, about what we're going to be covering in season 2, and for that matter, what we're going to be covering later on, much later on in season 4, the general shorthand terms to do with these things, the general shorthand terms. This is, again, it's one of the reasons why I ended up deleting, not vast segments, basically all of the original recordings that are done for what would have been the launch of season 2 at the beginning of kind of at the beginning of November, because what I'd done with the original version of season 2, I recorded it at the back end of October, going into the beginning of November, with the full intention of launching season 2 in the second week of November. But as I was looking back on the footage, more and more tech speak started to creep in, right? And the vast bulk of the people that are going to be watching these episodes for season 2, you're not going to have a clue what the fuck I'm talking about, right? So we're going to take this. The terms that are used for this can also be used for AIOs, but there's specific ones for an AIO that I'll cover in the latter half of this particular episode. So what we're going to look at one of these things from the top down, right? From the top down. And the same can be said for these things, because even though an AIO, there's your first term, AIO, all in one. In other words, the tank, which is up here, actually recedes into the actual battery part, all in one. AIOs, that's what that stands for. This is a stock coil sub-ohm tank, and the reason it's called a stock coil sub-ohm tank is because this tank takes a stock coil, in other words, a pre-made coil in a blister pack. You just pop the blister pack open, shove the coil in, screw the bottom of the tank down, and then screw it into your mod. So that's the differences between, that's the different sayings for the two different kits that we're looking at. Starting at the top, this bit at the top, you'll hear older vapors, like vapors that have been vaping since like 2014, 2015, call this the drip tip, even though you don't drip anything into the tank. The reason the name drip tip stuck around is because rebuildable dripping atomizers, RDAs, are not tanks. Basically, it's a coil down here at the bottom with a metal cap and a tip, and you just get your liquid and drip liquid straight through the top of the mouthpiece. Technically speaking, for tanks, for stock coil sub-ohm tanks and for AIOs like this shouldn't really be called the drip tip. It's actually the mouthpiece. That's what it should be called, but drip tip filtered down into tanks for some strange apparent reason. The tank itself, and in the case of the AIO tank that recedes in to the actual mod, they both take stock coils. Both of them take stock coils. And a stock coil, as I said before, is essentially a coil that the manufacturer's already pre-made for you. They generally come in blister packs of 3 or 5, depending on the company, and you just pop the blister pack open, take your coil out, shove it into the tank. Same goes for the AIO, shove it into the AIO tank, screw the bottom on for a normal for a normal stock tank, and just push it in and then whack your tank in like that for an AIO, and you're done and dusted. Stock coils are coils that have already been made. On the flip side of that coin, which we're going to be covering in season 4 much later on into 2023, stock tanks give way to rebuildable coils or rebuildable tanks or rebuildable drippers. But we're not going to bother about that for season 2 because we're concentrating on the mainstream here. Airflow control, kind of self-explanatory. At the base of this tank, what you're seeing down here is a big gaping hole, and at the base of this, at the same base is another big gaping hole. This ring at the bottom, as you can see, turns. you can control how much air gets into the coil. Same for an AIO. It looks a little bit different, but the premise is still the same. Buried in here is a ring that you can turn clockwise or anti-clockwise, and what you're doing is you're opening or closing a large hole at the base of that coil. The more air that gets into the coil, generally speaking, there's a kind of cut-off point here, but generally speaking, the more air gets into the coil, the more vapor that coil can produce. But there's a hard cut-off point, which is usually halfway through the airflow control, where you end up putting too much air into the coil, and in some cases, less vapor can actually be produced. Direct-to-lung tanks, DTL, direct-to-lung. That's that one covered, as well as what these things are generally all about. Whereas you, if you're relatively new and you've just went through season 1 straight to season 2 that you're watching right now, with your pod kit, is mouth to lung. It acts like a cigarette. You draw the vapor into your mouth, and then the vapor that's in your mouth gets inhaled into your lungs, like a cigarette. DTL is the exact opposite. You just breathe through the tank like this. Help if you opened up the airflow, Vic, you fool. Hold on. Try that again, shall we? That's the whole point of DTL. And again, the airflow control at the base of the tank not only dictates how much vapor is produced, it also, for a lot of the bigger tanks, dictates how warm or how cool the vapor can be before we even get into the power setting of the actual mod. A lot of people, when they're dealing with stock coil sub-ohm tanks, or for that matter AIOs, just simply crack the airflow wide open. For me, depending on who made the tank and how big the diameter of the bore of the coil is, it's either halfway closed or fully open. And talking about the bore of the coil, let's head down to the table cam and I'll show you what I mean here. The bore of the coil, in other words, how wide the diameter of the coil itself is, also dictates how much air can actually get through. I mentioned blister packs. This is a blister pack of 4 coils for the UL Crown 4, or is it the 5? Oh, sorry, it's the UL Crown 5. And you can see there are 2 individual coils separate from each other with what looks like a 3.5 millimeter diameter bore. In other words, the diameter of the coil that you're seeing in here. Now, UL coils. These big, yeah, I know it's Freemax, they love their big coils. These big fellas are for one of the older Freemax tanks, and this is a triple core coil. And the UL coils are dual core coils, and you can see the bore, the diameter of the coil that you're seeing here is much, much wider than the diameter of the bore that you're seeing for these UL coils, which means these coils here will let in and let through a lot more air than these coils here do. Now, the coil types, you've got single bore coils, which means there's only one single coil, usually with something like a 3.5 to a 5.5 or a 6 millimeter diameter coil, very, very wide bore. You've got dual core coils, these here. You've got triple core coils, these here. Then you've got quad core coils, you've got 5 core coils. In fact, I think it might have been Horizon Tech. This is during the insane year of 2016 and 2017, the insane years. Horizon Tech came out with a 12 core and a 24 core coil, which means there was 24 of these individual little coils in a freaking huge thing about this diameter, and it was just insane. Those days are long past now, long past. When you get a stock coil sub-ohm tank, or for that matter a larger AIO, it's usually single core, dual core or triple core coils that you're going to get for that particular kit that you're buying. And again, the larger the bore of those coils, the larger the bore, the more air is going to get through. So that kind of covers all the kind of shorthand like dual core, triple core, all those sayings that you're going to be hearing when you're looking at a stock coil sub-ohm tank. So that covers the stock coil sub-ohm tanks. And even though These might be different bits of kits. More about the differences between these two kits, I think in episode 5. The premise is exactly the same, because AIOs also take stock coils. Stock coil sub-ohm tanks, where the tank is separate, they also take stock coils. Generally speaking, when it comes to these two very different kits, the coils inside these tend to be smaller than the coils inside the separate tanks, but you still get single bore or single core, dual core, triple core, quad core. But for the AIO coils, because they're confined in space, they generally tend to be smaller, and the bore generally tends to be thinner, which means the draw, the direct to lung draw, the DTL draw, is a little bit tighter in an AIO compared to a stock coil sub-ohm tank. So we've dealt with the tank side of things. Now we move on down to here. If we take the tank off, this is not so much for AIOs, because an AIO tank is simply magnetised straight into the actual battery part. But for the stock coil sub-ohm tank, you're unscrewing a 510, which is what this little thing here is. In fact, you know what? Let's head down to the table cam again, get a better close-up view of this. This is a 510 screw, and this with e-liquid everywhere because this tank's leaking. Lovely. This is a 510 connection. And the reason it's called 510 is because it's the mechanical technical term. There's some kind of measurement, I don't know, I forgot about the measurement basis of this, but there's some kind of measurement that goes on with the actual screw and the depth the screw goes down. But this is basically called a 510 connection, right? Also, speaking of 510, out you come. This is also called a 510 connection, which doesn't really have much of a relation to the 510 going on down there. But you've got two different measurements for this type of drip tip. 510, which is what this is, and 810, which is what this is. This is the cap off of an RDA. There's your 810, and there's your 510, two completely different connections. So again, if in the future you're looking for drip tips or fancy drip tips for your tank, and your tank's a 510, make sure you get a 510 connected mouthpiece and not an 810, because it simply won't fit. But the connection down here is the 510 screw. You've got your 510 screw here, you've got your 510 connection here. So if you hear people talking about 510 connections, it's this. That's what they're talking about now. In the olden days of vaping, there were actually several different connection types. You had your 510, you had your 810 and 810D, which was lumped under 810, and you had your EGO connection, EGO, which was, I think that was developed by Joytech, from what I remember years ago. The 810, that got forgotten about years ago now. There is still some starter kits, and it's actual starter kits, like mouth-to-lung starter kits, that still use the older Joytech EGO connection, but the EGO connection is basically dying out. The major connection that's left, and what all mods are basically using these days, is this, which is your 510 connection. More about what is actually going on with this 510 connection when we have a look at mods separately. So that covers the connection part, which is how the tank screws onto the mod. Now we're going to talk about the mod. Why is this called a mod and not called a battery pack? Technically speaking, it kind of is a battery pack, even though in a lot of cases the batteries are actually external that you actually insert in. The reason they're called mods is a throwback to the old days of vaping, and we're talking about the days of vaping before I even started vaping back in 2014. When vaping first started, and we're going back even more than a decade now, we're talking about 2006, 7, 2008, the very, very early days of vaping. Back then, there was no such thing as high-powered vaping. There was no such thing as wattage control. There was no such thing as temperature control. What a lot of hobbyist vapors did back then, like vapors that like to tinker around with electronics, they used to modify torches. Hence the 18650 that got carried on into mods like this. The 18650, as I said in episode 2, was originally majorly developed for flashlights, for torches. And what a lot of vapors did back then, they used to tinker around with the body of a torch. They unscrewed the lamp part of the torch and they configured a way to mount a screw fitting to the top of the torch against the battery, and then they tinkered around with different connections: 810, 510, 810D, 808. I think the old 808 was still around back then, and they figured out a way to basically homebrew a modified torch handle that could supply more power to the small tanks that they were using back then. Modify, mod. The name basically stuck, even though this is not modified, it's a store-bought bit of kit. The mod name stuck. After all these years, vapors like me who never modified torches to use as vaping devices, we still call this a mod because the name essentially stuck. It essentially stuck. Yes, it's a new coil. Here we go. So that covers why this is called a mod and it's not called a battery or a battery pack. And plus, mod just sounds cooler, to be honest. It really does. The actual mods themselves, there isn't really a lot of extra glossary that comes with that, but when we dive into what the menus are all about, and there's going to be a lot more about mods in a separate episode, you've got the menu. So you've got your different power settings: TC, VW, VV, TCR, and all the rest of it. TC stands for temperature control. There is a setting in a lot of these mods and a lot of these AIOs where you can control the temperature of the vape as you inhale it. Again, a lot more about that aspect in round about season 5 or season 6. VV stands for variable voltage control. You can raise the voltage up or raise the voltage down. It's a much more older style of vaping that not a lot of people use these days. On the flip side of that coin, you've got VW. No, it's not Volkswagen, nothing to do with this. Variable wattage is a much more stable way of power-based vaping that's not locked into temp control. Bypass, which again you're going to see in these menus. Essentially what bypass does is turn your mod into a pseudo mech. Now, I'm not going to delve too deep into what a mech actually is, but these things are regulated devices. In other words, there's a board and a chip in these that regulates the power and keeps the power at a very even state. A mech has no board, no chip, and it's a lot like the old days of vaping with a modified torch handle. It's the power of the battery being shunted straight into your tank. And that's what bypass tries to replicate. Not really does it doesn't really do it all that well, but it tries to replicate what a mechanical actually does. So if you set your mod to bypass, it bypasses a lot of the regulation on the board and shunts a set voltage, usually 3.8 set or 4.0 set, straight into the tank. Again, not a lot of people actually use bypass these days, and that's the major terms that you're going to come across when it comes to the actual mod itself. And what you've basically seen in this, actually it turned out to be pretty long, 20-minute long-ish video, is the basic terms that you're going to be hearing over and over and over again when it comes to you dealing with items like this. There is a whole plethora more of terms when it comes to season 4. RDA, RTA, rebuildable coils, aliens, Claptons, what the hell's that all about? But you don't need to worry about that right now because you're dealing with stock coil kits. You're not going to be dabbling in rebuilding that much, if at all, if you're happy with the way that these two things perform. So yeah, hopefully that little glossary has helped you out, and there should be, if I remember to do it, timestamps down there that you can jump to specific words and what they actually mean. Anyway, that covers episode 3. On to episode 4.